How's it going, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Animal Talk Podcast with me, Ryan Ferguson.
And me, Ayrton King. Hi, Ryan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Ayrton?
Well, I'm doing a lot better than last week. I've got a stable internet connection. We can actually chat this time.
Wow. Yeah, that's exciting. At least you'll stay
Yeah,
online.
that's always fun, isn't it?
No dropping off the face of the planet while we're
I
recording.
know, and I'm so bummed because the last episode was so awesome, and I didn't really
Yeah.
get a chance to chat that much with Tammy, besides saying, "Hey, can you hear me?" So
Don't worry, I'm sure you'll get another opportunity.
fingers crossed. I hope so.
So, what is the topic for this episode?
Well, for this episode, I thought we could chat about exhibit design.
Dun dun dun.
Da, 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 da.
All right. Well, exhibit design helping with animal welfare.
Helping with animal welfare and, yeah, just improving animal health and longevity.
Yeah, improves their life, allows them to feel like they are, able to explore the exhibit and interact with things. I think that's really important. It's also enriching for them. We chatted a little bit about enrichment in a couple of our episodes, and in the episode with Gabby, and how important enrichment is, not just having to have it, you know, put down as a tick the boxes, but as a continuous thing. And I think that's where exhibit design comes into play.
For sure, and it's quite an exciting time at the facility that I'm working at because there's a lot of construction. There's some new exhibits that are being built, and that's also why I thought we could choose this topic because so often you go into a facility and the exhibits are already there. They're already built. They already have a structure, and you've got to basically add all these other elements. Whereas when a new exhibit is being built, you actually have the opportunity to build all those elements that you want into that exhibit so that it can basically function better and be more environmentally enriching. And yeah, so I just thought we could chat about that topic and then also just chat about the different things that an exhibit should really focus on, things you need to take into consideration when putting an exhibit plan together.
So in this one, you're throwing off the wetsuit and the goggles and whatever else you
I'm
use,
putting on
and
the
you're
hard
putting the
hat.
harder hat on.
And my safety vest and safety boots.
Yeah, very important. Health and safety.
Yeah, so I think when you talk about exhibit design, you have to think about the components that exhibit needs to make up. And on the top of my head, I could only really think like around four different main themes. So the first thing I would think about when I think about designing exhibit is the physical health of the animal. So you're talking about environmental control. So temperature, humidity, for example. You think about the space. How are we using that space when we build that exhibit? Is it a very complex environment for the animal? Is it got the suitable substrate? If you think of stingrays, for example, they like to sometimes burrow into their substrate. Is the substrate soft enough? So that's kind of all the physical components that are going to help with the animal's health. The second one would be your psychological well-being of the animal, and that would then incorporate, like we mentioned, your environmental enrichment, spaces where the animal can exhibit natural behavior, like foraging, for example. Have areas that the animals can exhibit choice and control. We chatted with Gabby about that and how important that is for animal in the environment. A simple example I can give you is, does an animal have the opportunity to move out of the sun and into the shade, or out of the shade and into the sun? So that would be all the physiological kind of needs and well-being of the animal. And then your third one would be the social dynamics. Is the animal got other, I want to call them friends in the exhibit? Is there a hierarchy amongst those animals, for example? And taking into consideration those group kind of compositions. And then Also thinking of, dedicated escape routes. I don't want to label them as that, but having space where the animals can retreat if they want to, or they can move away from the other animals if they need to. A really good example I can think from a lot of the work that I've had experience with is penguins, for example. The amount of times penguins fight over a nesting spot. So, having enough space that the birds can have their own nest spaces, and also having other nests available that if they want to move house like we move apartments, that there is space for them to do that. And then the fourth component would be the stress and welfare component for me. So that would think about more from the outside, if you're a visitor, and limiting that impact that the visitors have on those animals then in the exhibit space. So how do we reduce noise and crowding, for example? Or is there an area of the exhibit where the animal can choose to be visible, or if it doesn't really want to be visible today, it has some privacy? A really good one that comes to mind with that is if you think of going to a reptile exhibit. It always kind of freaks me out a little bit if an animal doesn't have space to hide away. And often we create exhibits in such a way that the animal is kind of forced to always be exposed and on show because, of course, we want the visitors to see them, but that's not always what the animals want. And then another one that is, I think, probably really, really important in this is, what is the routine of that exhibit that we have to do every day? And do those routines cause disruption amongst the animals in that environment because the exhibit was just designed poorly? So it's a real struggle to do your job every day. You've got to move things out the way all the time, create a lot of noise in that process. And of course, that's going to create a lot of stress for the animals in that environment. So you got to think about all of those components when you think about designing exhibits. And I always find it quite exciting because, as I said, like from the start, it's a new, fresh canvas, and you can think of all the different components that need to go into it. And then also taking into consideration the animal's natural history. So, what would they be doing out in the wild? What would their environment look like out in the wild? And always just remembering that a well designed, natural feeling exhibit for the animal is ultimately going to give you a happier animal at the end of the day. Poor designed exhibits often end up giving you animals that are showing stereotypical behaviors. So, yeah, that's just the kind of the four components that I think of when thinking about exhibits.
I have another component for you, and this is only because I'm more landlocked than you are, and I'm thinking about birds more in this one. But I suppose in an aquarium situation, you don't really have too much of a location problem. But for birds, a location is important because where you place that enclosure can be either more enriching for a bird or not as enriching for a bird. And I'm going to use birds of prey as an example. So, when building a bird of prey exhibit, a good place for that would be at a very high point in the facility where the birds are able to look over the facility from a higher perspective, because that is already way more enriching for them. Because birds of prey like to perch up high and just sit around doing almost nothing, waiting for something to come past. And they want to be able to look over an area. So having them at the highest point of an area really does help them and support them in the enrichment.
So all I can think about when you say that is, I don't know if you've ever watched those homemaker shows. All they always say is it's location, location, location. So there's our new category number 5, which is location, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very different when you think about like an aquarium. I don't want to simplify it too much, but it's basically you almost have like a box that you have to turn into a space that often it just has sides and has a front viewing panel. And that's also why I think I stress so much about making exhibit very enriching, because it's a sometimes quite a small confined space. And luckily for some of the animals that I get to work with, they're not there forever. They do get released back into the wild, but some of the other animals, they do spend their whole life there. So it's really important that we make that space as suitable for them as possible, and also as enriching as possible.
You make such a good point because you're focused on, what the public can see and how that all looks, and behind that, you're not too worried about. But I think at some facilities, I don't think there's many enclosures where you can walk all the way around them. Maybe there are some, but a lot of other facilities with other enclosures for other species will probably have some sort of side view as well. So you kind of got to think of that, and you don't want the public walking to the side where the animal is supposed to have a safe space to go to. You need to think about having it further away from the public so that that animal doesn't have to spend its time directly in front of them all the time, and it can get away if it wants to. So I think that's quite important.
Yeah, very, very important. As we said, like choice and control. And it's so amazing to think of, thinking of that environment and thinking that the animal, if the exhibit is designed properly with all of this in taken into consideration, the animal has a choice of what they do every day, where they go. And I think that's so important. And so important to be able to give that animal that opportunity and those choices. So, yeah, I like what you said there.
Yeah, and another thing to think about is doing your research. Make sure that you do research about what sort of environment that animal naturally lives in. That's quite important for you guys as well, but also important for mammals and birds, because you don't want to add stuff into the exhibit that could potentially harm them or not look like it's their natural environment. I think it's quite important to ensure that. So, doing a lot of research behind it. Also, you don't want to add something in that's poisonous. What happens if you add a plant into the exhibit without doing research about it and it's poisonous? You've got to really do your research and find out what's correct and what's not suitable.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think also on that topic, what you're saying is also just quarantining the animals as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think I know when I speak to a lot of visitors that sometimes come to the aquarium and they've got a fish tank at home, and when we start talking about how they acquire the fish, and then they just go to the pet shop and they get some fish and then they add it to the system, and really sometimes freaks me out because often there's so many things that you can bring into a system if you don't quarantine those animals. So I'm glad that this came up, because something I wanted to also mention is, like, for example, at the aquarium we've got a whole quarantine area. All of those fish, they are in separate individual tanks, and they don't have a lot of substrate in them, unless it's really necessary, because in quarantine basically we're wanting to keep those animals on a treatment, for example, and we want the tanks to be really easily cleaned. And if you have a lot of furniture and a lot of rocks and substrate, it takes away from being able to simply keep that animal in a clean, quarantined environment. So a lot of them are in these tanks. They don't have much substrate or any rocks, but often we give them different furniture, and most of the time it's in the form of PVC pipes. And that definitely comes into play when you think about the animal's natural history, in terms of, would they be found on the reef? Do they hide in between corals, for example? And generally, you'll find the species that, are kind of more elusive and prefer to hide away, they'll prefer to actually stay in those PVC pipes. So we're still giving them the opportunity to have a small form of choice and control and choosing where they want to be and some privacy, but it still enables us to do the quarantine process correctly.
Yeah, I think choice and control also comes into play when it comes about the whole idea of animals being compatible with each other, because a lot of exhibits are not just one animal in the exhibit. You've got multiple animals and sometimes different species, and you guys deal with that more than we do. Most of the time we've just got one species, maybe two in an exhibit or three in an exhibit, but for you guys you've got tanks with multiple. It's also introducing them in and understanding that they have to get used to each other. And is there enough hiding spots or areas where they can get away from each other if something has to go wrong?
Yeah, so that also brings up a really good topic of what we do so we call it like our mixed species exhibits or our community exhibits. So one of them is the big ocean exhibit that I get to look after. And one thing that we do is we have what we call an acclimatization cage. So basically, it is a transparent containment area. So it's either in the small exhibits we use perspex boxes, and we put the new fish in there first before they go into the main display. And that just gives them some time to see all the other animals that are in that exhibit. We've got turtles and stingrays and other fish species. And what's really important is the other fish get to come up to the acclimatization cage, and they get to interact with the new fish that are going in, and they get to see each other through the acclimatization cage, where it's still a safe and protected environment. And then after a few days, once those animals are comfortable, we'll release them from the acclimatization cage. And it makes such a huge difference just by doing that process and giving them some time to settle in and get used to their environment. One story that I can share with you with the coral exhibit, for example, is we call them fire gobies. It's a little species of fish. They're actually really, really pretty. We introduced them in the acclimatization cage, but there was concern because it was over a weekend that their acclimatization cage was actually hanging in the front of the exhibit. And the coral exhibit's really pretty because the corals just make it look so natural. So it was this really beautiful natural exhibit, but then there was this perspex box hanging in the front of it. So we were then made to move the acclimatization cage to the back of the exhibit so that it wasn't as visible, so that the exhibit would look good for the weekend. The fire gobies stayed in there, and we released them. And for the duration of their stay, after being released into the exhibit, they actually found refuge in the back of the exhibit. So because their acclimatization cage was moved to the back, that had become their safe space. And what that basically meant is when they went onto exhibit, they actually never really chose to use the front of the exhibit. They chose to use the back because they found that space more safe, because that's what they were introduced to.
That makes so much sense. Every time you bring up a new fish's name, I have to Google it and have a look what it looks like. So I looked to see what fire gobies look like, and they look like
And they're very pretty.
mini sharks with this long dorsal fin that sticks out of the top of the back, but look like they've got flames coming out of their tail at the back, which is pretty crazy. So it's like a silver fish with an orange mid and a very dark red and almost black end to their tail. Look like they're on fire and they're flying through the water.
Yeah, so another story that I have that I can share with you, and this is probably one of my favorite animals as well, is the little mud skippers, because they kind of spend half of their life on the land and half of their life in the water. I think you should know what these look like, Ryan, but you might want to Google them because they're just so cute. And
I know what they look
it
like.
was, and my job was to make a new mudskipper exhibit, because we had always housed them one individual in the exhibit downstairs, and now we wanted to make a mangrove exhibit with live mangroves and fiddler crabs and a whole bunch of mudskippers as well. The one
I've
issue
seen this exhibit. I'm
you
so excited you're talking about something I know.
we're gonna have to like attach a picture somewhere so everybody can see it. And
Yeah.
yeah, so one of the things we always had an issue is mudskippers are very territorial about their banks. So if you think of mudskipper, they're always on the kind of like the mud flats that are around mangrove forests, and they become very territorial over their burrows and also the embankment, basically. So that's why we chose to always exhibit one alone in its own little exhibit. But now we obviously had an issue because now we were going to get more than one mudskipper. So my colleague and I sat and we thought about, again, their natural history. Where do they come from? Where does the territorial behavior lie? What causes it? And we came to the realization that it is obviously the embankment, and they are very territorial about their specific embankment. So immediately we knew that first of all, we needed to create more than one bank in this exhibit. So we chose a very specific design where it almost had like two islands, and that would basically give the mudskippers lots of room to have their own little section on the mud embankment. And then we also decided that, the thing that changes the territory quite a lot for mudskippers is, of course, the tide. So as the tide comes in, the water level will rise, and then the bank gets smaller, or the bank gets larger as the tide goes out. So we realized that, one thing that will help us in this is if we have almost like a U siphon, which basically is a container that has a pipe that runs in a U shape. And when the container fills up with water, the siphon automatically starts running, and that would then pump that water into the exhibit, and then it would drain that water from the exhibit again. So that would kind of create a tidal system for the mudskippers. We created the embankment first out of crates, and then we used filler foam, and then carved it into the shapes and crevices that we needed. And we added lots of burrows basically on the embankments as well. And then started covering that with cement, and also carved into the cement so that it looked like an embankment. And then we got lots and lots of mud, and we added the mud into the exhibit, and also created, more separate little areas with more little burrows. And it was amazing to see just how well it worked, because we had taken all of these things into consideration about, how territorial they are and what actually drives that territorial behavior. So that's the story of the mudskip exhibit, and it is still there today. And it's got mangroves in, and it's still got mudskippers. And yeah, it's just a really interesting exhibit to watch, to see how they move around, and I love mudskippers.
I have this vision in my mind of two mudskippers having a territorial display with their mouths open, singing to each other, because that's what it looks like. They're just like ah with their mouths open at each other.
So, a funny story off that, mudskippers actually have really sharp teeth. I don't know if you knew that, but
They do not look like they even have teeth. They look like they're gumming.
So I got really friendly with mudskippers. I love to hand feed them, and of course, we would feed them mealworms. And I taught them to take the mealworms out of my hand, and especially the larger ones, they would sometimes get my finger, and they can actually draw blood. So yeah, their teeth are quite ferocious
Wow.
under those cute little faces that you see.
Who knew?
A
Who
ferocious
knew?
mudskipper story.
Well, I think we could probably talk for ages, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners are probably like, "Oh, my exhibit looks like this and this." So yeah, there's so much to different exhibits, and when you were talking about exhibits for our landlocked animals, not aquarium sort of animals, but with you guys have got a whole like water system that you have to look after, and that boggles my mind. Temperatures and this and that, but we only have to just worry about putting a pond in and maybe a water feature if needed.
If
Ours
you're
is not
lucky.
as intricate if you're lucky. But yeah, there's so much to exhibit design and making it really, really cool and interactive for both the animal and also to the eyes of our guests who come to view the animals, so that they can see exactly what type of environments these animals come from. It's all about educating as well, and making sure that the exhibit is educational.
Yeah, I think, when you stay true to the animal's natural environment, the public also get a little insight into where that animal comes from. And you create almost like, especially, working with frogs and toads for some part of my career, especially with the little terrariums and vivariums, you create these little pieces of art almost, that it's a little, glass terrarium that people get to look into. And it's, depending on where that species comes from, it's like they're looking into a little, section of a forest or a rainforest. And it's so important that you create an environment like that, so that the public get to see where that animal actually comes from, and what environment they would be living in, so that they could almost get a sense of not only respect for that animal, but also a better understanding of what they would need.
Yeah, so important. Very, very cool. Love exhibits. They're so fun to design, and it's actually really fun to watch guests interact with the exhibits and the species that are in the exhibits and see how they enjoy them. I think that's also a very important or exciting part of our job sometimes, is just watching the interaction and seeing how they enjoy seeing those animals in those exhibits. I think that's really, really cool.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, if you have built a exhibit, whether it's a big one, whether it's a small one, there's going to be two things that are going to tell you if it's a good exhibit or not. And the first thing is going to be the animal. They're going to tell you if they like it or not very, very quickly with no filter. And it's always a very humbling experience when an animal tells you, you built this, it's great, but it's really not for me. And the second thing that's going to tell you if it's a great exhibit or not is the public's reaction. So it's always really interesting to create an environment and then step back and watch how both animals and visitors interact with that environment as well.
100%. Well, definitely a really cool topic. And if anybody is wanting to carry on with the topic and let us know about your exhibits and how cool they are, please let us know. Any final thoughts there, Ayrton?
I think, just thinking about exhibits, I think each and every one of us, we have, obligation to our animals that we look after. I hope if you listen to this podcast that you go back to your facility, back to the animals that you work with, go look at the exhibits that they're in, and just think about, what else can I add to this environment that can make it more enriching, that can make it more natural, that can make it a multi-sensory experience for that animal. There's so many things you can do. You can change the lighting, you can add different textures, you can add different scents. Uh, you know, there's so much we can do in an animal's environment to make that environment better for them and ultimately better for their quality of life. Yeah, I hope that we inspire everyone that's listening. If you're in the industry, not only applying to, zoos and aquariums, it also applies to your pets at home. So many of us have fish tanks at home, or you might have a goldfish in a fishbowl, hopefully not. Um, so go home and look at your pets and think about, their space and how can you make their space more suitable for them. So yeah, that's really what I hope the takeaway is from this episode.
Yeah, those are all really important things. Thanks for that, Ayrton. And if you guys are interested in getting in touch with us at Animal Talk Podcast, please feel free to contact us. We do have an email address. It's animal.talk201@gmail.com. Please send us a mail. We like to hear from you guys. Let us know what you think of our podcast, any topic suggestions, even if you want to talk about this podcast and discuss some things that maybe you went through. And then you can also get hold of us on our social media, right?
Yes, we are pretty much everywhere. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn. For our YouTube and Instagram accounts, it is Animal Talk Podcast _ZA. So you can go check us out on our platforms. And also, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, share our various social media pages, and help us to just reach even more animal keepers, animal lovers out there so that we can share our knowledge, but also, just share our various topics that we have and get feedback and ultimately connect everybody, because that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's so important. Thanks for that, Ayrton. It's really important that you guys subscribe to our YouTube, like, comment. All of that helps try and get it out there to everyone. We really like to also hear from you. Tell us a little bit more about what you think about the podcast and maybe some ideas that you have. So you're welcome to contact us on any of those platforms, YouTube or even email. And of course, everyone, stay safe. And remember, animals are our passion.
Thanks everybody for tuning into this episode, and I really hope that you've learned something new. And remember that our quality of care is their quality of life. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
What's wrong with mud skippers? Why mustn't I mention mud skippers? Because your message was like, no.
No, don't talk about mud skippers on here.
Okay, I can start again about the mud skippers.
We do not talk about mud skippers on Animal Talk podcast. It's a no-go, okay?
Absolutely not. Okay, here we go.
Okay.